Now, the important part, I think, with RWAs is how do you get the physical asset if you decide you no longer want to sit on the digital representation for speculation purposes and you actually need the digital asset? And where's the line of demarcation between the speculators and the industry that actually needs those assets?
We're seeing these big projects such as Chainlink working with JP Morgan and all these other things, bringing supply chain onto the blockchain. What's your thoughts about all this that's going on with real world assets and supply chain tracking?
So I think RWAs in two different ways. When it comes to RWAs on blockchain for large scale businesses and putting chunks of inventory, chunks of value, items of extreme value on chain, they have a benefit there of proving ownership, right? History or record of ownership. And when it comes to things like retirement funds, like stocks and bonds, and things like that that go into a fund manager. When I was younger, you would hear the story about, and the stories are real. Someone would open a foot locker from the grandmother's house after the grandmother passed away and find a giant trove of war bonds in there that they bought for $50, and these things are now worth thousands and thousands of dollars. And so those types of RWAs sit really well with blockchain because you're just taking a digital representation of this stock or this bond or a silver dollar, okay, and putting that on chain so that it's easier to transfer. Now, the important part, I think, with RWAs is how do you get the physical asset if you decide you no longer want to sit on the digital representation for speculation purposes and you actually need the digital asset? And where's the line of demarcation between the speculators and the industry that actually needs those assets? And in the stock market and bond market, that's pretty easy. It's a bunch of speculators trying to buy and trade these assets. In the business world, where people are moving large quantities of products that have extremely high value to them, and it's important that you got it from the right source. That's very important. Those are the kind of things I think people would want to put on the chain. And I'll give you an example. Like when I was in the military, we had these very high critical parts, that anything that affected either safety or mission critical, and those things were tracked very heavily from the time they came out of non-destructive testing at the factory until the time you installed it. It required a signature at every checkpoint along the way. The package is intact. You get inspected. Okay, before I sign for this, I got to make sure it meets all these requirements, that I have this mission critical part. Now, when it comes to mops and sponges and paintbrushes, no, the Navy didn't have to, do that level of rigor with mops and sponges and paintbrushes, but you certainly needed to do it with mission critical, high value things that of that nature. That they had to be, absolutely pristine and robust when they installed a system. So there's different levels of granularity too. If you're moving large quantities of goods, what level of granularity do you want to track the goods on the blockchain? What's a good representation, and what do you want to store in a database? I don't know because I'm not in the business world, but I'd imagine those are the kind of problems that you're trying to figure out and solve, Dan and Brian, with Zengate. Like, kind of, what do you guys run into when you're trying to evaluate what's the level of granularity and what type of representation we want on chain? Do we want to represent a model number and a serial number? Do we want to represent a container number? Do we want to represent, you can scan the barcode? What kind of things do you want to represent on chain? And then do you want to represent the value of that item on chain as well?
I mean, I think granularity is very much a case by case type of thing, and a lot of RWAs. where one type of RWAs just don't need it. Like, you just don't need to know exactly everything, because number one, there is no real value to that information, because there is such thing as too much information. There's also such thing as information overload when you're actually speaking to, and it also depends on the application, obviously, right? So if you're doing something where traceability is used and tokenization is used for, say, auditing, compliance, and scoring, right? So if you're doing something like, say, what we were talking about before in our space yesterday, with traceability of, say, industrial metals, right? There you need pretty granular traceability, because there's a lot of things there that need to be checked, as you said, and in the case of the military, there's a lot of different checks that need to be made. I mean, versus like, okay, well, I get my apples. Okay, I mean, yeah, it's an organic apple. Okay, I know where it came from. I know the grower. Do I really need to know, as a consumer, do I really need to know the temperature at which it was grown, and the amount of time, and the soil acidity of the place where it was grown? Probably not. So there it is. So it's just basically, it's really up to the user and the user base and your audience. It's who is your audience. If your audience is somebody who needs that granularity, of course, yeah. But if it's somebody, and this is actually something that, kind of going back to what we're talking about application and mass adoption. We give people, we expect mainstream audiences to care about tools that they just really shouldn't care about in the mass scale. We care about them, and that's fine. But yeah, no, I mean, you're never going to be in a position where you're going to be able to explain to your average grandma how to use a full node wallet. Doesn't matter how decentralized and secure it is. There's just never going to be a sect of grandmas that's going to be into full node wallets. They just won't. And we have to accept that. So it's just like that. It's like that here. RWAs are really, it's a really broad sweeping term. It's a fad right now, right? In a way, in blockchain, because it's something to kind of grab onto to hedge against, versus, stuff that's really just perceived value, like, say, NFTs and such, and coins without, like meme coins or whatever,
Yeah.
coins that don't have anything to back up that value claim. And people are just really into that. And so that's what I think. That's why I think it's important. And that's also what I think the answer to your question here is that it just really depends. It depends. There's never one straight answer to that.
Yeah. And, it's interesting you say that, because items of high value or critical value, James said in the chat, medical devices, critical things, mission critical, high value,
Right.
and level granularity. And what do you want to track? And what's interesting is if you say, okay, which blockchain do I use? So what if your supplier uses blockchain Cardano and the shipper uses blockchain Algorand, and then your receiving device is on blockchain Polygon? Okay, and how do people make those entries in the blockchain? And this is where the application layer and the aggregation layers will come in handy, for such as aggregating metadata, because all of these chains, you can put metadata in some way, shape, or form, and somehow you're gonna have to be able to read that data and say, how did this get from point A to point B? Did we have to go through 3 different blockchain systems in order to do it, or has that been abstracted from the users to the point where you can very quickly get the data, but you could tell that it's absolutely short? I was watching that clip from your previous podcast with the gentleman who, what industry? Oh, he was also in the tea industry, and he said, when you have businesses that are worth 100 million and 200 million dollars, your reputation is important, and you don't want to compromise your reputation based on some transient piece of data that was lost.
I mean, it's it's kind of like one of those things. It's about necessity, and it's about also why is the necessity there? Because people are just they don't want to be screwed around with. I mean, yeah, as James said, physical asset authenticity was hard to prove until blockchain. It is pretty hard. It's in the words of George W. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, well, you ain't gonna fool me again.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the paradigm here is. You ain't gonna fool me again if we utilize these things.
Yeah,
So,
it'll be good on blockchain futures for guys like me. Like I'm not buying large quantities of stuff because I'm not a manufacturer, right? But commodity futures. Can you imagine if you put commodity future RWA, like I call it an RWA, it's not the commodity itself. The commodity is the RWA, but then take the commodity future, put that on chain, and allow people to trade it. They could program swaps on Axo Trade and set a time and set all the parameters for when they want to make the trade.
What do we need? What do we need to get there? And actually, what direction do you think it'll take? Do you think that we're going to go to where we do have legislation saying that this deed is on-chain deed is the same as the paper deed, or are we going somewhere else? Are we going towards a more complicated or complex ownership structures that are kind of using, understanding how to navigate the jurisdictional seas to have these assets actually being enforceable and regulated? So, I mean, what are your takes on that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because a lot of times I see people say blockchain fixes this, and I'm like, no, it doesn't. It gives blockchain gives you a very robust system to store data, extremely immutable, almost indisputable way of storing information. So I'll roll back to my story about the critical parts. Okay, so these critical parts came at a cost. When you have a part that comes from the time it leaves non-destructive testing until it's installed in the system, somewhere along the way it has to be shipped, it has to be stored, it has to be inventoried and checked, and then eventually it's needed and installed in the system. It has these checkpoints all along the way. These checkpoints come with a lot of overhead. Blockchain does not automate that. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a database or a blockchain. Somebody has to scan the data. Somebody has to type it into the web browser, right? And so, and then there's systems of checks and balances in place. Is the person qualified to be checking the data? Is the person the right person to be putting that data in the database? Is the correct data in the database, or is the correct data on the blockchain? So there's a certain amount of overhead that comes along with that, and I think where we find the value of blockchain is, where does it make things easier in that process? Where's the current pain points? Like if I have a hand scanner that I can scan a barcode on items that are moving and it generates an NFT that this person bought it, great. It's like a receipt, but it's a high value item. So you don't want just a piece of paper receipt that falls away. You want proof of ownership. That person owns this item, high value item, or whatever that asset is.